On a stinking hot January day more than 180 years ago, there was an incident on the Murray River. It was a flashpoint in the brutal politics of the Australian frontier, another colonial drama. But surprisingly, this one ends in a form of compromise. At the centre of the drama was the explorer Charles Sturt in a whaleboat on his journey to map the furthest reaches of the Murray-Darling River system. On this particular day, he and his crew had probably disturbed a ceremonial gathering of Aboriginal clan groups on both sides of the river. The threat almost spilled over into violence. Until recently, William Rowell's 1931 painting of the incident was gathering dust, hiding out even, in the Art and Heritage Collection of the City of Melbourne. That's until the artist and curator Paula Balla was invited to work with the 7,000-odd items in the collection. And so she put together an exhibition, what she calls a reinstallation, but all round the painting she's put work by contemporary Aboriginal artists. The show's called Incident on Swanston Street, and the Rowell painting is just the starting point. I have to tell you, there's something strange about this painting. The artist, William Rowell, wasn't a witness to the drama, and he didn't paint the incident until 100 years later, after a trip to the Central Desert. I met with Paula Balla at the City Art Gallery on busy Swanston Street.
We are standing in front of a very large, it's about 2 metres wide by about 1 metre and a bit tall, very kitschy, and I mean that respectfully, painting from 1930 by an artist called William Rowell, who called himself Will, and it depicts, the title is An Incident in Sturt's Trip Down the Murray River in 1831. And it depicts an incident between Captain Charles Sturt, who was, his job was to navigate and chart the Murray River with some assistance, some convict assistance of his, and an incident between them and some Aboriginal men of the Murray River who aren't named, they're not named.
It's a flashpoint. We know that there's a drama unfolding here.
Well, from Sturt's journals, which are a very interesting read, his account tells of, travelling along the Murray, and he's also described in newspapers from not long after, about 40 years after the event, as being kind to the blacks and being a benevolent kind of a character. And he did describe, these people in sympathetic terms. He also described the smallpox and measles and leprosy that he saw, the illness amongst the Murray River peoples. But as he travelled along, he was passing on a message. So at some point I'm gathering that he picked up some local language or protocols, and he was getting the message delivered to the tribes he was coming across along the river. But at this point, the message failed to be received by the people there, and he's near the junction of the Murray and the Darling rivers. And this flashpoint, Rowell's depicted a quite benign version of it compared to the journal entries that I've read, and from what we know orally, as Murray River people. In this painting, it's somewhat still. There's hints at tension, particularly from the men in the background of the painting who have their spears raised, and they're quite animated, and they're even moving into the water towards Sturt and his whaleboat, which was purpose-built for the trip. And there are Aboriginal men in the foreground. There's 3 of them, and there are 2 behind a tree. They're quite dark. They're in the shade of this very large gum tree, and one is moving sort of in a bit of a reluctant way, I think, towards the boat. So from the accounts, what's happened is that they've gotten to this point, and it's become very tense very quickly, and the potential for violence and for chaos it's almost about to tip over. So we're really looking at a almost tipping point. And from Sturt's journals, we actually know that it got to the point where his gun was raised at one of the men who he described as a chief, and spears were raised, and it got very tense and very frightening, and he told his men that they weren't to fire until both of his barrels were discharged. Now, at this point, one of the Aboriginal men from the other side of the bank runs across, because we're in a sandy shoal at this point, so it's quite shallow, and he throws himself between Sturt and the other Aboriginal man, and he's yelling and he's waving his fist. And they're also alarmed by this break in the tension that Sturt's boat sort of drifts off, and everyone kind of backs off, and he floats on down the river. And the other important point is that at this stage, Sturt offers a leaf as a sort of a peace offering, and the chief that was going out accepts it, and then they make their way. And then as they're making their way past, one of the convicts at the back of the boat throws a tin kettle out to that man as a thank you. But it just absolutely blew me away. Just visually when I saw it, growing up on the Murray River, I connected to the trees in the painting and the water. And also there's not a lot of Victorian Aboriginal people depicted in paintings from that time. So that really intrigued me, and that's when I started researching the story a bit more. But there's also the conflicting narratives that aren't depicted within this painting, and that's what I wanted to challenge, because even Sturt's own journals, he talks about the fact that there were women there. They were in the background, and that he said they were holding baskets of darts. So they were assisting their men in this prepared either battle or defence, and they were wearing what he described as whitewashed buckets on their heads. Now, I know from the incredible work of Marie Clark about Kopi caps, that very important part of Aboriginal women's mourning processes along the Murray River. So I'm imagining that the people in the foreground of the painting have been disturbed in a mourning process, and it's almost as if the mob on the other side are trying to defend them and protect them from that being interrupted, because the men in the foreground are, they're in the shade of that tree, which is intriguing as well to me. But they're in this position of compromise and reluctant kind of compromise in order to assure the safety of everybody else, despite these interlopers coming up, into their country. So there's a lot there,
And the mourning hats, the Kopi hats, white clay was used on the head as a sign of that the community was in pain.
Yeah, when they'd lost a loved one, the women would cut their hair off and they would make these caps, which would weigh up to 7 kilos. I mean, these were heavy. I was very honoured to be a part of Marie Clark's ritual mourning ceremony, where she invited, I think around 30 Aboriginal women and men to participate in her beautiful exhibition. And we got to recreate Kopi caps, which is such an emotional and spiritual, intense experience. And I really thank her for that. And it helped me, gain insight into the journal, into the painting, into understanding. And there is a lot of mourning, there's a lot of sadness. We carry that with us as Aboriginal people, the past walks with us, and we carry our losses with us, and we experience it far too much, more than non-Indigenous Australians have to. There's also a defiance there, but there's a lot of loss and mourning in that painting.
And just standing back now and looking at that image and seeing how, what is there is reflected in the other work. This has been called a reinstallation because the work that we're looking at, the William Roll painting, which inspired this exhibition, it's kind of an object of shame almost. I mean, it's been languishing for some years, but it was displayed prominently in Town Hall here in Melbourne for a long time.
Yeah, it was. And I think perhaps at some point in the city's consciousness, they perhaps might have thought it was a little bit politically incorrect, and we needed to hide it away. So that process interested me. It had been up in Canberra, it had been at the National Gallery, it had been brought back down to Melbourne, and that was in 1974, the year I was born. So I was just really interested in all these correlations in its movement. And the fact that the painting itself crossed the Murray River and came back down again was really interesting. And I guess in a way, I mean, people might think I'm being irreverent by, putting it in amongst, gum leaves lying the length of the floor underneath it, and, treating it in this way. And I'm not being deliberately, provocative or disrespectful to it. I'm actually just wanted to replace it. I wanted to refigure it from my perspective as a Koori woman and an artist, and I wanted to get a talking to, if you like. Like, I wanted it to create a dialogue between the past, the present, contemporary work, and different versions of the same thing